Hey guys, it's Miss Vinson. Today we're going to look at a couple of graphs that describe whenever the government gets involved in the market. First, let's talk about what happens when the government decides that they need to put an excise tax on something. An excise tax is the same thing as a sales tax or a per unit tax. To see the effects of an excise tax on a graph, let's start out with the market at equilibrium price and quantity. Right now, our equilibrium price is $8 and our equilibrium quantity is 1,000. Now remember, when you draw your equilibrium price, that creates two triangles. The triangle up top that's below the demand curve, that's your consumer surplus. And the triangle at the bottom, that's producer surplus. Notice right now, in a market with no tax, consumers and producers are maximizing their surplus. We could go ahead and figure out how much consumer and producer surplus these groups are experiencing before a tax. Well, that's going to be 1/2 4 times 1,000, which is going to be 2,000. And when we look at producer surplus, that is also 2,000. Total surplus in the market is the surplus happening to everyone in the market. So our total surplus is just going to be our consumer surplus plus our producer surplus, which is going to be $4,000. Now suppose the government wants to put a $4 sales tax on this item. We're actually going to take the supply curve and shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. Before a tax, sellers would not even consider supplying anything less than $4. Now after the tax, sellers are not even considering supplying anything below $8. Now notice, whenever you shift your supply curve up by the amount of the tax, there's a new equilibrium that's created. That new equilibrium price is the price that buyers have to pay after the tax. So consumers have experienced an increase in the price of what they're paying of $2. Equilibrium quantity at that price level is 500. So here's what's happening in the market. Consumers are going to the store now, and instead of paying $8 for this item, they're paying $10 for this item. So they're kind of bummed out. Now you may think that the sellers are pretty excited because they were only receiving $8 before, and hey, now they're getting paid $10. But not so fast. Because the first thing that the sellers have to do so they don't get in trouble with the government is they have to give the government their $4 tax. So even though the sellers are getting handed $10 by the customers, they don't get to keep all $10. They have to give 4 of those dollars to the government, and then what's remaining is actually what the seller gets to keep and put in the cash register, which is only $6. So it's really not a good deal for the seller either, because previously in equilibrium, they got to keep all $8, but now once they give the tax money, all they get to keep of that $10 is just $6. So they're actually losing $2. Now this graph can look confusing, but it's all about shapes and being able to identify the shapes. So if you're good with shapes, then hopefully this is going to help you out. Notice that after the tax, we have a baby triangle at the top of the graph. That is all of the consumer surplus that consumers have remaining after the tax has been put on the market. So if we do 1/2 base times height on that new baby consumer surplus triangle, which we would be doing 1/2 2 times 500, we see that our consumer surplus now is just 500. So consumer surplus fell by $1,500. What about producers? Let's figure out producer surplus. Producer surplus is the little baby triangle at the bottom of the graph. It's going to be the difference between how much the sellers are receiving, which is $6, and how much it costs them to produce, which is their original supply curve, because their production costs haven't changed. They're just not receiving as much whenever they sell it. So we're going to do 1/2 base times height on this baby triangle at the bottom coming off the supply curve for our new producer surplus, which is also going to be 500. And so we see producers have lost $1,500 in producer surplus. But consumers and producers aren't the only players in this market anymore. We actually have a third player that's involved in this market, and that's the one that put the tax on the item. That's the government. There is actually a shape on this graph that represents the money that the government is making off of this tax. Do you kind of see a great big box that's all up in the middle of your graph? It's sort of messing everything up. Well, you guessed it. That big obnoxious box in the middle that's messing everything up, that's the government box. And so if we want to find out how much money the government is making off of this tax, we know how sales taxes work. They're going to be collecting $4, which is the vertical side of that box, times the number of items that are being sold, which is 500. So the government's bringing in a total revenue of $2,000. You can think of that as like surplus to the government. So remember, total surplus is all the surplus that's happening to everybody in the market, and right now we got 3 players in the market. So after a tax, you're going to add together the consumer surplus that's still remaining, which is only 500, the producer surplus that producers are hanging on to, which is only 500, and then the government surplus, or the revenue or the money that the government is making, which is $2,000. So total surplus after a tax is now only $3,000. There's one last shape that I want to point out on your graph, and that is the shape of a beak. Take a look at your graph. There should be a shape that kind of looks like a beak, all right? Usually, guys, anytime you see a beak on a graph, it means there's a problem. That beak is not a good thing. That beak is called deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is what we call that loss in surplus to society, usually as a result of some government action or actions by some firms like monopolies. So take a look at that beak. It's just a triangle, so we could do area of a triangle on that beak. So we would be doing 1/2 4 times 500. 4 times 500 is 2,000, and half of that is 1,000. Well, notice how 1,000 is how much our total surplus decreased by. So what's going on with that beak? Well, that beak used to be consumer and producer surplus. Consumers were enjoying some savings in that area before the tax. Producers were making some profit in that area before the tax. But who's getting surplus off of those 500 units now? Nobody's getting surplus off those 500 units. Why? Because those 500 units, they aren't even being created anymore. They don't even exist. And that's sad, because everybody likes surplus, so a loss in total surplus to society is really a bad thing. That's called deadweight loss. Now let's talk about another type of government intervention, which is called a tariff. Now a tariff is kind of like a tax that the government puts on imports. So if people in our country really love some of the products that are produced in other countries, that might hurt some of the U.S. industries that are making similar products. If we always want to get the ones from Japan and nobody really wants to buy American products, then that's going to hurt American sellers. So sometimes the government will put a tax on those imports and make those imports a little bit more expensive. Well, that will deter people from buying so many of those imports, and it should encourage people to buy more domestic or U.S. made items. It can also raise money for the government too, because after all, it is a tax. So there's going to be some tariff revenue, money that they're making off of this tax on the imports of the products. So let's see how this looks on a graph. And again, this is all about the shapes as well. So don't get confused on all the different lines and things on the graph. Just really narrow in and focus on the shapes of the graph. First off, let's say we have a market that's just naturally sitting in equilibrium. When the market's sitting there, it has settled on an equilibrium price of $15 and an equilibrium quantity of 5 units. Now, before any tax or imports or tariffs, we can look at the consumer surplus and the producer surplus and the total surplus in this market. Consumer surplus is $37.50. Producer surplus is also $37.50 as well. So this is another graph that's symmetrical. Not all graphs will be symmetrical. So when we add together consumer and producer surplus, we get our total surplus, and that ends up being a total surplus of $75. Now that is going to be with a closed economy, when we're not trading with other countries. So in the equilibrium example we just did, the only place for customers to get their product was from U.S. suppliers. But if we have an open economy and there are many other places to get this product, maybe the customers have found that it's cheaper to buy this product somewhere else in the world. Maybe the price level of this product somewhere else in the world is $9 instead of $15. Well, customers are like, why am I going to pay $15 from U.S. sellers when I can just buy it from these other international sellers for $9? So when the customers start buying this item at $9, we see that consumer surplus increases. Now that they're only having to pay $9, the quantity demanded is 7 items. But you know who's not happy about that lower world price? The US sellers. Because at a price of $9, they only want to supply 3 units. The people want to buy 7 things, but there's only 3 things being made by the US companies. So where are customers going to get those other 4 items? They're going to import them from the other countries. So now our consumer surplus is a really big triangle. Consumer surplus is now $73.50. US producers, however, are not so fortunate because US producers are only selling 3 items. So their producer surplus is much smaller and it's just going to be $13.50. Well, you know what's going to happen eventually. The US firms, the US businesses are going to complain about this and say that it's not fair. And they're going to try to get the government to put something in place to help prevent so many of these imports from coming into our country. And so the government decides they want to put a $3 tariff on the import of these items. Now what that means is that when these items are imported, they're $3 more expensive than their original import price. So instead of getting this at $9, customers are going to have to pay $9 plus the tariff, which is $12. Well, since customers have to pay a little bit more, then we know that their consumer surplus is going to shrink. At a price of $12, customers are only willing to buy 6 instead of 7. But now that the price is a little bit higher, US producers are supplying 4 items instead of 3. So now because of this tariff, which moved the price level up to $12, we still have a shortage, but it's only a shortage of 2 units. How are customers going to find those other 2 units? They're still going to import them, but when they import them, they're having to pay a $12 price. So now let's see what is consumer surplus after the tariff. Consumer surplus after the tariff, when they're paying $12, is going to be $54, which is still greater than the original consumer surplus they had before the open economy, but it's $19.50 less than they had when they had full open trade with no tariff. So consumers are a little bit bummed, but at least they're still getting their items. Producers definitely benefit from this tariff because their producer surplus is going up. They're selling more items. Instead of 3, now they're selling 4 at a higher price. So after the tariff, their producer surplus is going to be $24, which is $10.50 more than they had before the tariff. Customers are losing a little bit of their surplus. US producers are getting a little bit extra US producer surplus. And since it was a government intervention, since it was a tax, you know that there is going to be a box that represents the money that the government is making off of this. Now notice that this box is a little tiny box in the middle. So the government's making $3 on each one of those 2 units that are imported. So that means that the government revenue or the tariff revenue is $6. Now where is our beak? Where's our deadweight loss? We always know that whenever the government's messing with markets, there's going to end up being deadweight loss, but nothing on this graph looks specifically like a beak like we had before. Well, in this case, the beak has kind of been split up. If you take a look at the tariff revenue box, notice how there's a little tiny triangle on the right-hand side and a little tiny triangle on the left-hand side. Those 2 tiny little triangles are your deadweight loss. Now, why are those 2 triangles your deadweight loss? Before there was a tariff, that used to be consumer surplus. The whole consumer surplus triangle used to come all the way down to $9. Now that there's a tariff and the price is $12, there's some items that aren't being imported anymore. So since those items aren't being bought by the US customers, since those items aren't being imported, that's savings or surplus that they had before the tariff, but now after the tariff they miss out on that surplus. And so the deadweight loss is going to be the little tiny triangles beside the box. Alrighty guys, I know you'll get this as soon as you practice it a couple of times. Those shapes are going to be popping out at you. You're going to know as soon as you look at these graphs exactly what you're looking at and what they mean, and you're going to be able to find everything that you need. So until then, check you later.